everybody. I hope everybody's having a good Sunday. I'm sorry about the kind of rough start. I had to figure out some stability issues, but it looks like we are nice and stable now. So this is our 8th week in game for Apothecaria, with our 6th session since we started doing them. And give me just a moment because I have not sent out my usual little notification that I'm streaming, so I need to do that real fast. And then yeah, we can get going on the stream. I have some tea with me this week because my voice has unfortunately been a little rough. But hopefully not too bad tonight. Let me get this sent out real fast. My phone decided to autocorrect live with lice for some reason. Alright, let me get this all entered. And hopefully that posts the way I want it to. It probably won't because I post on Tumblr because I don't honestly use Twitter much anymore. Since Twitter has kind of become a crapshoot. But Tumblr likes to be a little bitch about links for whatever reason. And it drives me crazy. So it probably will not do it the way I would like it to do it. But I can at least give it a try. And then I promise 2 more seconds and we will be done with this boring part of it. Alright, it didn't do it the way I wanted it to, but it will work for my purposes. Alright, so last week, we spent some time talking with Volux and his brother. And we did get to find out Leary's favorite song when Vollux's brother Sterling sang it to us. He unfortunately also hit us with an arrow because he thought we were a truffle thief. So Marcius is still currently healing from that incident. We don't really know if the song has any real, value as far as trying to figure out what happened to Leary or not. But it is another piece of the puzzle. And then we also, let me remember who our patient was last week. Because I don't. Oh, our patient was, that's right. our patient was Damien again, who burned his hand while baking, and couldn't find Colin in town, so he came out to us to get some help. So we helped him out and was able to get him healed up from those burns. While doing that, we did run into Folly by the Wayfarer's Stone, who was the giant who gave us Larry's favorite book that he had borrowed before she disappeared. And we have started to pick up on some things that maybe there's a reason everybody's not talking to us about what happened with Leary, beyond just them being, sad about her disappearance, that maybe there's something else going on with that. And so we kind of pick back up with that. We ended last week basically with Marcius getting home and having Sieg help tend the wound of the arrow that he had taken. And so we are starting with May 8th, 8th week of spring. Sieg has been doting on me non-stop since my injury. My shoulder is healing up, still more than a little tender, but I think I'm in the clear as far as worrying about infection. Maybe you should let this whole thing go. It's not like you knew this Leary, and if this is how her friends treat you. It's something that Sieg has said to me several times over the last few days, though I could tell he had no illusion of convincing me at this point. We both were sat at my desk as he finished changing the bandage on my shoulder for the morning with some fresh hiker's helper to dull the lingering pain. I've told you it was a mistake. Nothing to do with the investigation into what happened to Leary. I repeated my response to him as I've done each time. I had the map spread out in front of me, trying to pinpoint mentally just where one of the other marked locations would be. It was a spot near the mountaintops, and, given I wanted to go and visit Folly to try and get information from him, I hoped I could possibly locate the possible base camp as well. That doesn't change the fact you don't know her. Sieg sighed as he finished up, and I looked up at him. I understood the concern. I appreciated it even, but he knew well enough that I couldn't just drop this. I can't leave it untended. We look after each other, even if we don't know each other. I would hope someone would do the same for me. Sieg looked at me for a long moment, and I knew he had taken that personally. I hadn't even been missing back then when he'd left, but the danger had still clearly been there. Well, then I suppose I'll be sticking around for a longer while then, too. Where are we looking next? We went over the plan together then, as I explained the map and what I'd found the marked locations were so far. I assumed the other locations would be other base camps that Leary had set up, but the other icons were a mystery aside from Merrow's ruined throne. Sieg seemed less than thrilled to be going to see Folly next, but I assured him that there was unlikely to be any accidental arrows from him. We set out towards the mountaintop a little before midday. Sieg carried my satchel so I didn't have to worry about the weight, and Briar followed along behind us. She had been rather glued to my side if I'd stepped out of the house. I had a feeling the only reason she was trailing behind at all just then was because Sieg walked with me. Card drawn, a 7. I had decided that we would try to navigate to the spot on the map first, as I felt I had an idea where it was located. We had passed the Wayfarer's Stone a while back and started up into the foothills before we diverted off the main trail. The main trail that led up to where I'd first met Folly, and instead cut down a smaller trail that led off to the side. We were passing through a valley when Briar seemed to spook a little, hooves stamping as she came to a stop. I felt a nervous twist in my gut as I moved to try and calm her as Sieg scanned our surroundings, clearly on edge himself. The form came slinking out of the tall grass in front of us, a grin on its human-like face as it sat down in the center of the path. I have a riddle, one you must solve if you wish to move forward. I heard Sieg's exasperated groan as the Sphinx grinned at us again. I felt that knot in my chest ease at the sight of the cat-like creature, knowing we weren't really in any danger. Briar didn't seem to feel the same as she huffed at the creature, tried for a moment to push forward as if to try and trample it. The Sphinx gave an indignant hiss as it scurried and jumped up onto the rock just on the side of the path that almost looked like a podium. Briar seemed ready to just charge past it now that it was out of the way, but it resulted only in more stamping of her hoofs. Even she knew that now that we'd been challenged, we wouldn't be able to pass the boundary of the Sphinx's territory. Its magic would turn us back if we tried. Maybe we should let her trample them, Sieg muttered under his breath as he turned to look back at me. We both knew that wouldn't work. A Sphinx wasn't likely to do much but be an annoyance unless you openly attempted to harm it. If provoked to actually attack back, a Sphinx's bite would quickly turn to infection and death, sometimes even with treatment. Perhaps I just won't let you pass, the Sphinx said pointedly back at us. I apologize for both of them. Please, may we hear your riddle? I hoped to placate the Sphinx before it really did decide to keep us from being able to reach our destination. It studied me with one open eye as it licked one of its paws clean. What has cities but no houses, forests but no trees, and water but no fish? The Sphinx sat up straight to look down at us as it spoke, though its eyes stayed on me. I looked back at Sieg for any suggestions, but he just gave a dramatic shrug. He clearly was going to be no help. His patience with these sort of things had never been great, and that clearly hadn't changed. It took me a few moments thinking over the riddle. I felt like something that was likely a clear guess. That it wouldn't be something too obtuse to figure out. I wasn't the best at riddles, though, and I didn't necessarily mind them. It was a frustration now, given I had hoped to have time to both find the location of Valeria's map. A map. The thought of my intentions of the day had made something click into place with the riddle. A map would, of course, have cities with no houses and forests with no trees. It almost felt too coincidental in the moment. The Sphinx looked at me with a pleased expression for a few seconds before giving a dramatic stretch as it climbed back down off the rock. You can pass, until next time we meet, at least. It sounded bored now, even as it walked up to me and brushed against my calves like a regular cat. It was disconcerting, given its human-like face that looked up at me before it slinked off into the tall grass again. It disappeared from sight quickly and silently, just as it had appeared. Card drawn. An ace. We continued down the trail after the Sphinx had gone, headed deeper down through the valley. It seemed to cut down through the foothills, lush and overgrown as we went, and Zeke complained about our encounter. Unsettling little assholes. I got stuck once for 2 days because of a pair of them. Set themselves up, one ahead of me on the trail and one behind me, and neither would let me go until I answered their fucking riddles. I rolled my eyes at the story I'd heard before in the past, though I couldn't help the amused smile. It was one of his standby stories he would tell new captive audiences when we had traveled together before. Usually, it was with a bit more joviality and bravado than he had just then, as he complained in the middle of the woods to no one but me. I was feeling tired at this point, maybe not quite as recuperated as I liked to think, and I leaned against Briar's side for a bit of support as we stepped down into a small gully. I paused long enough to pull out the map to try and check where we were in relation to the marked camp. If the gully we were in was the same as what was marked on the map, we should have been close to the camp. There was no clear, obvious camp in sight, though. The original camp had been well hidden as well. It would likely be tucked away somewhere. Zeke had kept walking when I stopped to check the map, and I heard his voice ahead of me. I folded the map back up and tucked it away so I could catch up with him, worried that we had come across another roadblock in our search. I found him at the bottom of a decline, the bottom of the gully where water trickled through, and he had to take my arm that wasn't injured to help me. I told Briar to stay up where she was, not wanting her to risk coming down the steep slope and then struggle to get back up later, and I could tell she wasn't pleased with the suggestion. She listened, though, stayed up above as Zeke and I started to follow the little gully up the stream of water. If the map's correct, it should be somewhere just ahead. The last one was hidden from view, though, so I imagine this one will be as well. I felt discouraged. I could see ahead where the gully seemed to end, where it met up with a cliff. Water ran down from the cliff face, feeding the small trickling stream. Maybe the base camp was actually higher up. Not down here, where it appeared on the map, but above where the waters came from. I felt discouraged as well, as my shoulder ached even more now. Just the motion caused by walking had been enough to aggravate it anew, and I felt a bit of dread at the thought of hiking back and then further up to find Folly. But I wanted to speak with him. I wanted to try and see if he could offer any more information on Leary. I would guess it will be up there. I would guess it will be in there. Zeke spoke up and pulled me out of my thoughts as he nodded his head to indicate something ahead of us. I dropped my gaze from the cliff above and, at first, didn't see what he was talking about. As I watched, though, a sheep seemed to appear out of nowhere as it drank from the stream. After a few moments, it turned and wandered back out of sight again, seemingly into the stone face of the hillside. Zeke gave me a small nudge, and I nodded to indicate we should investigate. Whether it was that he'd noticed I was feeling worn out, or if it was Sieg being Sieg, he took my hand to lead the way and helped me over some of the slippery areas. As we got closer to the rocky hillside, the sheep came back into view and seemed to notice our presence. It bleated at us happily as it trotted over, and I noticed that it had a bright blue collar around its neck. I recalled Siobhan's sheep all having the same color collars from when I'd visited with them, and wondered if this was a lost member of their flock. Sieg crouched down to meet the ewe as it came up to us, making comforting reassurances to it as he pet it. I think it belongs to one of the locals, a friend. We should take it back to them when we're done, I said as I joined him, giving the sheep some scratches behind its ears that it seemed to enjoy. Well, we'll have to help her up out of here, but then it shouldn't be too hard to herd her back. Should we go in and take a look, see if your predecessor left anything here? Yeah, let's see what's here. We headed into the cave, water dripping down onto us and the sheep trailing behind us. I cast out a light once we were inside so that we could see more clearly. In the far back of the relatively shallow space, there was a table set up, much like I'd found out in the woods. On top of it, damp from the cave water, there were some papers spread out, but the space seemed relatively empty. It was clear this was used as a base camp, just like the other was, but it didn't seem much was stored here, likely due to the nature of the spot. There were pegs anchored in the stone wall where a hammock could be strung, but if it had been left behind, someone had taken it at some point. I shifted through the pages and found them to be some messy notes filled with observations. The ink was a bit smeared with water that had soaked into the paper, but I could still make out some of it. A few things were clear and familiar, notations about characters from the book, and landmarks that Leary must have felt were similar in the area. There is an old hiking stick leaning in one corner as well. Clearly an old ranch that had been cleaned up and carved down to work as some extra support. Given the location, it was likely was a welcomed tool to have on hand if she'd been exploring the area. I took it with us as well, if only because it was something that had belonged to Leary, even though it didn't have anything that seemed special about it. It felt a bit disappointing that this was all I found, even though it did confirm for me that the numbered locales on the map would be all base camps like this. At the very least, I could mark this one off as being the last spot Leary had set up camp. There was no indication that this had been some final stopping point before a wayward exploration. It seemed unlikely she had used this as any sort of long-term stop either, given the damp. The moss had grown up on the walls to the point where even the anchors for the assumed hammock were partially covered. No, this location may not give me much more than a few extra notations related to the book, but it at least allowed me to mark this spot on the map off as a possible end point. Not much of a place to look at, Sieg spoke up as he kept the sheep entertained so it didn't wander. No, unfortunately not. But at least we've seen it, and at least we know now. I moved over to him and opened my satchel that he wore on his side. I tucked the papers carefully inside, tried to position them so that the damp from them wouldn't seep too much into my own journal. Are you feeling up to the hike up to the top today? Sieg spoke close, and it reminded me of nights leaned close together next to the fire as we camped wherever we'd found to be flat enough to set up. I took a step back as I closed the satchel and looked up at him. I could feel the pain was wearing on me. There was a chance that we'd have to hike quite a ways to find Folly, since I didn't know specifically where he might be, and it was already later in the day than I had hoped. Hiking back down in the dark, if it took that long, would be an even more difficult task. I hated leaving it, but let's take the sheep back for today. We can hike up and find Holly in a couple of days instead. Right, then let's get back to your briar. When we get back to the house, we can change out your bandages again too. Sieg seemed relieved that I suggested we not make the hike today. I knew, in theory, that a few more days to potentially speak with Folly wouldn't really impact the overall result of anything, Leary had been missing a long time before I'd even arrived. If my previous conversation with her former friend so far had been any indication, I'd likely not be getting the missing piece just from one conversation. Still, the entire hike back towards town to return the U to Siobhan, I felt like I was doing a terrible job at all of this. I had never claimed to be an investigator, though. Even during my travels, my role had always been mainly to heal or supply some magical guidance from time to time when I could. This is a new sort of role to be taking on, and for some reason, I seem to be the only one making the attempt to do so. I was glad to see Siobhan and Mary's house come into view as we cut through the edge of town. The sheep had easily followed along with us, with some coaxing from Sieg, and purely through Briar's presence. You seemed a bit fascinated by Briar, as it followed close behind her, as if flocking with her. As we drew near, I spotted Siobhan out in the pen with the rest of their herd, and gave them a wave. I somehow, despite the ache in my shoulder, forgot about my injury for a moment at the sight of them, and waved with my injured arm. I cursed as I felt the pain sharpen again, and heard Sieg give that kind of stifled laugh that made me shoot him a glare. Siobhan's lost sheep was ushered back into the flock with a bit of fanfare. Apparently Siobhan had realized that morning that they were short ahead, but hadn't been able to locate the lost sheep when they went out looking. They even slipped Briar a salt lick to enjoy at the back of the house, where she could rest while Sieg and I were invited inside. Mary was just as doting as she was last time, as she got Sieg and I a late lunch put together, despite my insistence it wasn't necessary. Sieg had no such compunction, as he happily accepted the offer. Siobhan and Mary were, once more, welcome company. I was glad to see Siobhan's Yeti chest had obviously cleared up entirely by now, as the thick chest hair was gone, and their voice wasn't quite as gruff as when we'd first met. "Do you want a bit of tea made with Hiker's Helper? We've always got some on hand," Siobhan asked as they sat down with us to eat as well. I had explained about my shoulder injury after they'd been worried by the clear pain I was in when I had waved earlier. "I would love that, if you don't mind. I thought it wouldn't bother me so much just from a hike, but I think it was still a little too much." "Were you looking for reagents in the valley? Siobhan could try and collect some things for you, if it's nothing too hard to find. They head out that way a few times a week this time of year because the sheep like the sweet grasses that grow in the hills." Mary got up to grab the kettle to hand to Siobhan, who had moved to make the tea. I enjoyed watching the two of them together. They moved so in sync, in a way like a dance around each other in their small space. I appreciate the offer, though this time we weren't looking for reagents. We were hoping we'd find some clue about Leary's somewhere that seemed to be a possible lead. Didn't turn out to be much of anything, though. For a second, Mary seemed almost confused by who I meant, but then she shook her head lightly, as if clearing away the moment as she sat back down next to Sieg. "That's a shame. It's kind that you're trying to find out what happened to her. It was so odd how she was just gone one day." Sieg glanced at me, and I knew that he had caught it as well. Granted, it could have just been a brief lapse, but it was just another thing that made me wonder if there wasn't something more going on. "Do you remember anything from around when she disappeared?" Sieg asked between bites of his food, in an attempt to seem nonchalant about the question. Siobhan and Mary both seemed to take a few moments to try and think about it. Both of them, for a moment, almost had a blank expression on their faces as they seemed to try and recall any detail. Then, they both shook their heads slowly, with looks of regret. It was almost too similar of an expression on each of them. I don't. I just feel like things were all like always, and then one day, people started to realize she was gone. Maybe someone went out to get treated by her and she wasn't there? I can't remember exactly how we found out ourselves, other than it spread through town that she wasn't around anymore. I honestly think most of us assumed she had just moved on. Siobhan looked almost guilty at admitting this, as if it was the first time they'd really processed the fact that none of them had thought to look further into it. I reached out and patted their hand gently in reassurance. I couldn't see it being something intentional on their part. Just as it was hard to believe that Follix, Folly, and Emerus would be hiding something about Leary's disappearance intentionally, given the way they carried their sadness plainly in their expressions. The only one I would say I didn't have a certainty on was Colum, but even with our brief meeting, I couldn't bring myself to think he'd have anything to do with it at all. At the thought of Colum, I wondered if I could convince Sig to swing by the Lunar Tower so we could speak with him. Since we weren't going to hike up to see Folly today, it felt like a decent compromise without really going out of our way. Maybe it would feel like we'd achieved something today. We finished eating, the conversation steering away from Leary, as it felt unnecessary to cause any more potential distress by pressing. It seemed clear that Siobhan and Mary weren't likely to have much information, as it didn't come off that they were super close to Leary. Or, at least, they didn't appear to remember being super close to her. It was starting to stray into evening when we left, my shoulder aching far less with the help of the tea and rest. But as we started down the street, I broached the subject of the tower. Are you sure you're up for it? Zeke eyed me skeptically, as we paused on a corner that would determine whether we turned towards the tower or not. I could tell he wished that we would just return to the house. I wanted to get something if we could. Anything that might prove useful. I am. I doubt it will take long. Colum didn't seem the type to draw out conversation if he didn't have anything to say, and that's if he's even there. There was every chance that Colum could have stepped out, that he possibly was dealing with something in some other part of town, or even was just taking advantage of the nice weather to spend some time outside. All right, but be careful with your shoulder. I don't want it getting jostled any more than it already has today. Zeke said this with the authority of someone who knew the first thing about medical aid. Though, I have to admit, he'd done remarkably well in helping me with my injury so far. I wondered if he'd done any sort of research, or tried to learn some during the time we were apart. He'd been able to wrap my bandage without the old clumsiness that he would have had once. It didn't take us too long to make it to the Lunar Tower, though we got some distinct looks as Briar walked alongside us. She was rather conspicuous, walking down the town streets, besides me and the fact she resolutely stuck to my right side, as if to protect me from being bumped into. More than just a few people had stepped to the side, out of her way to avoid her walking straight into them. Most of the looks were of wonder, at least, and not annoyance, aside from those who chose to play an ill-thought-out game of chicken with my dear familiar. By the time we reached the tower, we had a small group of children following us and gawking. I worried a little about leaving Briar outside on her own then, as I hardly doubted that Colum would welcome her into the tower. I'll stay with her. You go talk to the mage. Siege nudged me, gently as he saw me stand there watching the children form a huddle a few feet away from Briar. She seemed relaxed despite their presence, but I appreciated Sieg's offer, as I knew he'd keep anything from getting out of hand. I walked up the steps and knocked on the door, wondering if it would even open. It did, rather quickly, almost as though he expected me, and Colin motioned for me to come inside without saying anything. I heard you were in town. Word travels fast when you come walking through with an elk, Colin said in a way of explanation once I was in and the door had closed behind me. The tower was lit up in a rainbow of colors during the day, the sun shining through the glass and crystal windows to scatter the colors around. Attempt number 1 for a joker. For a jack, so it is a fail. And as a reminder, when speaking to the main group of friends for Leary, I am currently drawing 5 times during the conversation to see if I get a joker to figure out if I get any actual information from them or not. And that's kind of my own home rule to kind of see if I can get some more information before the season ends. Colin had moved to stand at one of his tables off to the side, where he was clearly working on something. I moved to stand beside him and looked down at the papers that were strewn about. It seemed like it was notes on some crystal properties that would complement or repel each other. Research for some goal I couldn't suss out just from the glimpses I saw here. You're hurt. I was shot with an arrow by Follix's brother Sterling because he thought I was stealing truffles. I watched him out of the corner of my eye for a reaction to my mention of Follix. I hadn't really gauged much just how well this group knew each other, or if they were really all individually Leary's friends outside of one another entirely. Sterling has always had a sensitive trigger finger, Colin said with a matter-of-fact nod of his head. Clearly, they knew each other well enough. Glad to see it wasn't fatal. Yes, I'm apparently lucky he intended it to be only a warning shot. Colin gave a soft huff of air through his nose that almost seemed like a moment of laughter. He pulled a box that was off to the side onto the table and opened it. Revealed a meticulously organized arrangement of crystals that he scanned over for a moment before selecting one. It's not much compared to that ring, but it will offer some more protection. I blinked in surprise as he pulled a thin leather cord out as well and managed to quickly fashion it around the crystal so it would hang like a pendant. He offered it to me. I apologize, my voice is not happy with me today. He offered it to me, and I took it, feeling a bit knocked off center by how quickly he was to give me something like that. Thank you, Colin. I tied it carefully around my neck so that the crystal hung over my sternum. The weight of a strange comfort and a warmth that came from the crystal that seemed entirely its own. He waved his hand dismissively as he closed the box back up. Attempt for Joker number 2 was a queen, so that was another fail. Colin went back to the papers on the desk, shoved several of them aside to reveal a map of High Rannoc that he seemed to be charting out locations that related to these crystals on. I watched for a few moments in silence to try to get an idea of just what all of it was. You put up protections around the town. The different crystals he'd mapped out would offer different layers of protection, I realized. The sites he was charting out around the edges of town would serve as a boundary. To create a protective boundary like this would even be a task for a witch to do. Colin, it had to be extremely taxing, even if he tried to charge each crystal up independently. Yes, the old barrier that helped protect the town was gone, so I've helped with a new one. I have to refresh it monthly and often shift the position of the crystals. Colin pointed out the details on the map, how he had started with just recharging the crystals as they originally stood, but after a few months found they failed earlier and earlier. Shifting the crystals each month helped prevent the erosion of the protection, like alternating crops in a field to help replenish the soil of specific nutrients. I could help with this, Callum. You know that. You don't plan to stay, though. It's better if I just keep it up, or I will lose track of the rotation. My first instinct had been to ask just why Colin thought that I wouldn't be staying, but I also realized that I had probably stated so in passing to people in town so many times during my first few weeks here. I still couldn't say that it wasn't the truth either. There was every chance that once I figured out what had happened to Leary, or accepted that there was nothing to discover, that I would decide to leave again. Leave with Sieg. Leave on my own. Either way, that was still the plan, because I hadn't allowed myself to really make any others. I had thought about it in passing, staying here, but my roots were still ready to be pulled up at any moment. Colin seemed to understand I had no response to the accusation. He didn't seem to need one, as he just continued working on charting out where he would need to shift the crystals next. A third attempt for a Joker was a 7, which was another failure. I tried to get back on track, even as my mind lingered on my own uncertainty once more. I wanted to try and get some sort of information from Colin if I could. Maybe it was best if I just came out and asked. Colin, I came to ask about Leary, about if you recall anything that might help find her, or at least figure out what happened to her. Do you remember anything unusual from around when she disappeared? Colin paused in his work. It was a long pause, drawn out and almost unnerving, as he seemed frozen in place in those seconds before he stood up with a sigh. No, I can't. Leary is. She was always doing her own thing. I saw it around the edges then. That sadness I saw in the other three when I brought Leary up. And it was like a weight on Colin. Nothing at all then. Was there anything she may have been looking into? I wanted to see something. Wanted to know what his answer would be. If there was, I didn't know about it. Colin's words were a similar echo to Follix's when I had asked the same sort of question. If Leary had been looking into something around the time she disappeared, they didn't know about it. It felt almost practiced or rehearsed. The look on Colin's face was one of frustration, though, and he balled his fist at his side and hit his thigh in apparent agitation. Colin. My suspicions were getting a little more solid as he gave a shake of his head and turned away. It didn't seem aimed at me, but rather at himself for not being able to give me something. I wanted to try to push again, mindful that I wouldn't want to push too far. Fourth attempt for a Joker was a 5 and another fail. I found some camps of hers in the area. One had a map with different landmarks noted down on it. The one I found today only had some waterlogged notes, but it does seem like maybe she was researching something. I hoped that maybe if I led Colin a little further, that he'd be able to give me something. I wished I had my satchel so I could get the map out to show him, but Zeke still had it on him outside. I got the feeling if I left the tower to try to get it that Colin might not let me back in. If she was, I didn't know about it. He said it again, and I could hear the frustration this time. Colin paced a tight circle for just a moment before he seemed to decide to go back to his work. Final attempt for a joker. A 4. Another failure. Column, does the serpent and the rose sound familiar to you? I thought of asking about the book from Folly specifically, about how Leary had thought it was related to the area, but instead, Maro's tale came to mind and how it might relate, so I asked about it instead. I said I don't know. Colum yelled it this time. A fist hit the table in front of him, causing the boxes near it to jingle with the sound of shifting crystals, and I bit back any further questions, knowing I had pushed too far. It all seemed to melt out of Colum immediately as he moved to a nearby chair and sat down with his head in his hands. The door to the tower banged open as Seek came in, apparently alarmed by the shout, and I waved at him in reassurance as I moved to kneel down in front of Colum. I'm sorry, Colum. I won't ask anymore. I don't know. I know. I'm sorry. I stayed with Colum until he had seemed calm back to his quiet self. He apologized several times, but never fully offered an explanation beyond being upset. Even if it was that alone, it was enough of one. But I knew now that it wasn't likely the only reason. There was a reason I wasn't able to find much information about Leary here, despite it being a town who knew her for years. Despite her friends who clearly missed her. Something else was holding them back. And if I couldn't figure out what it was, I could likely figure out what had happened to Leary to begin with. May 12th. Zeke and I had argued the other evening when I got back. It was again about whether it was safe for me to be looking into the disappearance of Leary or not. I assured him that Colum hadn't actually been any sort of danger to me, but he seemed less than appeased by it. I said something I shouldn't have. Tossed out the fact that he could leave like last time if he was so concerned about the danger. I could see that it hurt him, just as it had come from a place of hurt for me. Do you want me to leave? He'd asked as some of the steam had died out of his voice. I shook my head, because I didn't. I had been dreading that he would at any moment, because there really was no expectation that he'd stay for this. It was my task, but I didn't want to do it alone if I didn't have to. I shouldn't have said it. I'm sorry. I sat down, arms stiff, though at least the aching had started to ease as things healed more and more. No, you've got the right. I want you to understand that I'm not leaving this time. Not you. I'd leave this whole mystery behind in a heartbeat if you were leaving it too, but I won't leave you this time. Why? Because I regretted it last time. More than anything. Why do you think I was out there kissing frogs? I thought my best options had been thrown out by my own stupidity. That was enough to make me laugh, to break some of that tension. We talked for a while after that. Talked about why I was staying and what would be reason enough to leave. I divulged to him the fact that there was a part of me that somewhat longed to stay, even when the mystery was solved. How I didn't really know fully how I felt about that part of me. Patient suit drawn was Diamond. And the ailment card drawn was a 2. The conversation went late into the night, and this morning I woke late to a knock at the door. I dragged myself up and out of bed to answer it, and found an adventurer I hadn't met before standing there, looking on edge and seeking help. Had like a hair or something on me. I invited him in and made coffee as I tried to shake off the fog of sleep, enough to grasp everything he was saying. He stated his name was Charlie. I managed to catch that much between the talk of rodents and chewed walls. Why he would come to me for such an issue was a mystery at first, till I slowly started to fully gain my faculties and realized he was the giant rodent he was talking about. The last full moon, Charlie had felt ill, so he'd gone home to bed early. But when he'd woken up the next morning, he'd found the house trashed by what had appeared to be a giant rodent. He had thought some animal had broken in at first, but his wife had told him that it was him who had caused all the damage. He hadn't believed her story that he'd turned into a large hamster who rampaged until she managed to let him out of the house and run loose in the surrounding woods. At least not until recently, as the next full moon started to get closer. He was noticing now the desire to chew on wooden things, to burrow and dig. The full moon wasn't even for another few nights, he stated, but it had started to set in heavily on him. I assured him that I would help. Zeke had stumbled out of his room by now and looked unsurprised to find a patient there for me to treat. I said that I would need to head out to find some reagents and asked him once more to please keep my patient company while I was away. High Rannoc, case number 8, Charlie, an adventurer, suffering from photothropy, can be cured with reagents that treat curse and hair. Only 6 turns to be able to cure. I knew that nothing I had on hand would work to treat the proper components of photothropy, so I would have to find both, and in a limited time frame. This was exceptionally so, given that Charlie was rather off on his time frame for the next full moon. The full moon would be tonight rather than in a few days, and given he was in town rather than at his isolated home, that rampage could be far more destructive. Heroes Hollow. I paused this time when I returned to Heroes Hollow to gaze up at the skull, try to really define its shape amongst the overgrowth and soil that had built up around it over time. There was a shape to it that was similar to those of dragons. Parts of it had clearly broken off at some point before the bones had truly fossilized, but the majority of it still stood. But digging into this sort of possible history really have been risky. Granted, the history of the region was well known, and it may cause some upheaval if an alternative was found. But everything from the story to this heavily fossilized skull stated it was long before anything else was really established here. I had to pull myself from my contemplation, knowing I had to help my patient by finding the 2 reagents within the depths of the dungeon before things got hairy. Event card drawn was a 9. Timer is at 6. The first reagent I needed would be easier to spot than the second one, but it would be a good indicator for the possibility of the second being around. I needed to find some skeletons to begin with, and then I hoped they would signal the existence of ghosts, or at least the trails of goo they sometimes left behind. I traveled the path down further into the dungeon, well aware that anyone who had passed closer to the entrance had likely been gathered and given a proper burial if it was possible. I wasn't fond of dealing with the dead in terms of reagents, but when it came to curses, there was little else that worked a lot of the times. I did ponder with some amusement just who would have cursed Charlie with turning into a giant monstrous hamster of all things. I passed the section with the hermit snails trailing their slime, down past where I had last seen the furry vendor who seemed to have moved shop to who knows where within the dungeon. I'd got into a dark section that felt cold, and water dripped through from the ceiling, sending echoed notes throughout. I cast a second light out to help see if the floor was slick. As the floor was slick rock, and there were a few real markers to guide the way. I spotted something off to one side, ghostly white against the almost obsidian black of the stones, and moved to investigate if I had found the bones I was looking for. They were in a tattered pile, rotted clothes around them still, but portions were worn through, and I picked carefully through them as I said a quiet prayer for the person. Whoever they had been in life, that they had ended up here. Perhaps they could find some peace in the fact that they'd be helping another adventurer out long after they were gone. I turned quickly as I heard a shuffle of feet, worried for a moment that I'd stumbled upon some necromantic playground, and found myself face to face with Sean once more. He appeared far less self-assured and cocky than he had the last time I'd seen him in town. In fact, he looked a rather lot like he had the first time I'd found him, and I felt an edge of something vindictive try to surface. I don't have time for this. Please, don't just leave. The others, they heard how it was you that got me out of here last time, and they tricked me into coming with them, and then they abandoned me as a joke, but I've never been down this far. Oh, gods, what are you doing with those? Sean had noticed the 2 ribs I held in my hands, and I sighed as I put them carefully into my satchel. I stood up as I dusted my hands off on my pants to face him. I should leave you here to find your own way after how you've acted. I knew I wouldn't, but I couldn't deny the temptation to do so. Please don't. I promise I won't act that way again. Please, you can't leave me down here. There's something else down here, a ghoul or a banshee or something. I narrowed my eyes at him as I tried to determine just what to do. I couldn't leave the dungeon and then have to hike all the way back in here just to show him out. And if he had really seen something, could it have been a ghost? Yes, a ghost. He grabbed my arm pleadingly then, and I couldn't help the thought of how pathetic he was acting. That may have been punctuated by the fact that he grabbed my right arm, and, though feeling far better than it had, it still let me know it didn't appreciate the weight of a grown man pulling on it in fear. Point out where you saw it, and then I can lead you out of here for 10 silver. I knew I would lose time escorting him back out, if he was as clingy and slow as he had been last time. So, if he was able to direct me to where I might find some of the ghost goo beforehand, it would be a relief to know saving his ass wasn't going to cost Charlie another night of rodentry. So, due to agreeing to escort Sean out, we preemptively lose 1 time on the timer. So our next event card drawn is a 6. Our timer is now knocked down to 4 due to that lost point of time. Sean looked indignant for a moment, as if he'd forgotten where he was when I suggested the price for escorting him out again, but a sound not too far from us seemed to remind him what his choices were as he nodded enthusiastically. It was back there. He pointed towards where the noise had just come from, and I made sure one of my cast lights stayed with him, while the other followed me in the direction he'd indicated. I didn't see anything, though. It was admittedly colder the further back I got. It may have just been a normal feature of this section of the dungeon, or it may be that there really was a spirit still actively lingering around. I scanned the area for the glow of the ghost goo, but there seemed to be no sign of it. I was about to call back to Sean to make sure he'd pointed me in the right direction, when I took a step and suddenly the ground wasn't beneath me. I slid down the smooth stone chute and landed hard on the floor beneath, and splintered wood and dirt scattered around me. I heard a distant scream from Sean, no doubt due to the light I'd left around him going out as I lost concentration during my sudden trip with gravity. "I'm fine," I called up after I had taken a second to try and assess. Not that Sean cared about that. I could hear his muttered panic about how was he going to get out of here now, though there was some relief in his voice as he realized his escort wasn't entirely down for the count yet. I stood carefully, already hearing the lecture from Sieg if I'd managed to break something on the way down, but everything seemed relatively intact. I cast a light for myself again so I could see my surroundings and found that I was in a small cell of some kind. On the barred door of the cell was exactly what I had been looking for, the soft glow of ghost goo around the bars and near the lock. At least I wouldn't have to search further for it. I carefully searched in my satchel, realizing a few of my jars had broken in the fall, but I found one that still managed to be in good shape to gather the goo into. Once that was done, I set about trying to pick the cell lock to get myself free. It took a few tries, but the lock was rusted and of an old make, so eventually more fell apart than really unlocked. The result was the same, as I was able to open the door to the cell and get out. I followed a path that led up back into the original chamber. When I emerged up there, I came out standing not far behind where I could see Sean's form, as he stared out into the darkness, waiting for me to come back from the other direction. I smirked as I snuck up on him and then loudly shouted directly behind him. A few things happened in sequence when I did this. The one I thought was Sean wailed and dissipated into a wisp that shot down into the tunnels of the dungeon, which caused me to scream in surprise. Then, I heard Sean scream just a few feet behind me where he was actually standing and had apparently just witnessed me scaring a ghost who then scared me. I couldn't help it as I cracked up with laughter at the entire situation. Sean looked at me as if I'd gone mad, but he still followed along with me as I led the way back out of the dungeon. It did take longer than I had hoped, as he clung to my side and startled at every little thing. Still, we emerged into the daylight, and he tried to immediately storm off, only to be met with the jeers of his friends. Perhaps less friends than just peers, but either way, it was clear they wouldn't be falling for him bragging about having to save me again. I reminded him about the tin silver payment, and almost felt bad about the embarrassed blush on his face as he shoved it at me. When he stormed off, his friends followed and called after him that they would have gone in after him, but they'd seen me and assumed I'd find him. I headed back to the house then, with the needed ingredients in hand. When I arrived, I found Sieg and Charlie sitting in awkward silence as Charlie tore at little strips of blank paper that Sieg must have given him to distract him. So, our silver will go up to 85, since we agreed and got Sean back out of the dungeon again. Bane of Photothropy. Ingredients: ghost goo ×2 boiled, skeleton dust ×2 crushed. Step 1. Place ghost goo in the cauldron and add 1 part water to 2 parts goo. pit over heat, and bring to a boil for 5 minutes. Step 2. Take pieces of skeleton and break them down first by hand and then with mortar and pestle, until you have a cup of bone dust. Step 3. Once goo has boiled for 5 minutes, remove from heat and immediately add the skeleton dust. Stir until fully incorporated. Step 4. Let mixture cool until just warm to the touch, and then transfer to a parchment-lined sheet. Place in icebox for 30 minutes, or until firmed up into a toffee-like candy consistency. Step 5. Afflicted will likely have a high impulse to chew on things. Use this in your favor by having them chew on pieces of the goo candy. They should eat at least 2 ounces for the next 3 days if the full moon is far enough away. If treating on the same day as the full moon, the afflicted will need to eat at least 6 ounces by an hour before moonrise to try and curb the ailment before the moon rises. Step 6. Afflicted can keep the remainder of the candy substance on hand to curb any lingering urges to chew for up to another month, though most find it distasteful given the common ingredients. The rest of the day was spent sitting with Charlie as he, at first, chewed almost incessantly at the toffee-like cure. Zeke watched with obvious distaste given he was aware what had gone into it. By the evening, Charlie's enthusiasm had waned, though I had to encourage him to finish the last bite of the cure just to be certain the curse was completely cleansed. For the sake of my home, we all went and sat out on the front porch then as we waited for the moon to rise. It would be the only way we would know for certain. I had little doubt at that point, given Charlie seemed much more calm and a lot less like he wanted to gnaw on the side of the table. But it would still be good to know. As we sat, I asked if he knew who would have cursed him with something like this, purely out of curiosity. He shrugged and seemed to think on it for a bit before musing that it might have been a woman he'd had an affair with. She had apparently threatened to find a way to tell his wife what a rat he was. Never mind that a hamster wasn't quite the same as a rat, but I didn't feel the need to ask a lot more questions after that. At least he wouldn't be chewing through people's homes tonight, or hopefully any other night in the future. Marcius. All right, and we are done. And I apologize because I feel like that was a little bit rough between my voice and stuff. But we made it. So, we gain a reputation level. So we are officially up to reputation 11. So now that we're up to 11, that means next week we can start treating intermediate ailments. We've only been doing the novice ailments so far. We also will get 20 silver from Charlie, so that brings us up to 105. So we may take a look and see if there's anything we want to add to our inventory as far as tools or anything like that goes. But yes, so no new real clues about Leary, but it seems more and more that we are having the suspicion confirmed that something is keeping the others from really talking about her and what may have happened. And we did confirm that the base camps, so the numbered locations on the map are confirmed to be base camps. And yeah, our reputation is officially high enough. We can start treating slightly more serious ailments now. thank you to anybody who stopped by. I do apologize because I do feel like my voice was a little rough this week. I'm not sure. I think it's allergies, to be honest. Everything is going crazy without flowering and blooming around where I am. And I think it is just a little bit driving my allergies crazy. But next Sunday, we will meet for the next session, which will be week 9. Spring, the spring in the season, in the game, is coming up to almost being over. Each season in game is 12 weeks. So with next week being 9, we're getting pretty close. And then we'll be moving into the summer season in game, which kind of grown like I did not intentionally do this, but I have realized that my in-game dates pretty much kind of match up with the actual current dates. And will continue to do so unless I have to skip a week for anything. So yeah, thank you guys for joining. I will probably stream a game later this week. Might be Wednesday again. I kind of would like to try to stream like Tuesday, Thursday, but I'm gonna have to kind of see how I can swing that. I did look into some new games, so I have a couple of different games that I'm hoping to bring on. But I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much for stopping by. All right, bye-bye.